Journey IFC strives to create safe spaces to worship God. Know that you are welcome just as you are, regardless of religious background or lack thereof, skin color, political affiliation, sexuality, age, culture, or any other label you own or society throws on you. You are welcomed and celebrated here just as you are.
I'm Nathalie, Grateful Journeyer, and I want to suggest that you listen to this like a poem, not like God speaking through the Holy Bible.
Yes.
There's a metaphor here, and it's comparing a city to a woman. How lonely sits the city that once was full of people. How like a widow she has become, she that was great among the nations. She that was a princess among the provinces has become subject to forced labor. She weeps bitterly in the night, with tears on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she has no one to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. Judah has gone into exile with suffering and hard servitude. She lives now among the nations. She finds no resting place. Her pursuers have all overtaken her in the midst of her distress. The roads to Zion mourn, for no one comes to the festivals. All her gates are desolate. Her priests groan. Her young girls grieve, and her lot is bitter. Her foes have become the masters. Her enemies prosper, because the Lord has made her suffer for the multitude of her transgressions. Her children have gone away, captives before the foe. From daughter Zion has departed all her majesty. Her princes have become like stags that find no pasture. They fled without strength before the pursuer.
What a comfy reading after the hard week we've had, right?
Yummy!
Yay, I just feel so cozy, right? I'll be honest, our reading this morning is just a taste of what the Book of Lamentations is all about. It's this book full of lament and pain, and it was written after the fall of Jerusalem, when the Babylonian army, the Babylonian people took siege of the Israelite land and destroyed everything. Everything was wiped out. The Israelite people at this time were nearly wiped off the face of the earth by the destructive forces of the Babylonians. In the Book of Lamentations, we find a collection of 5 poems. As Nathalie suggested, these are all poems. And each of these poems detail the horrific actions that took place during and after the siege of Jerusalem. Lamentations happens to be the most recent Bible study that we're still doing. We'll have one more week. It was a hard Sunday today. We didn't finish today. We'll finish next week. That's okay. But what we've done is we've joined as a community in this time of lament and grieving, and we've read this entire book cover to cover. So for those who joined in on the class, even if it's just one time in the class, you may be familiar with some of the stuff I'm about to talk about, because we've been walking through this book together for quite some time. We have taken this super deep dive into this book, looking at, the language. We've examined the original context. We've played with some Hebrew, which I always love doing. We've even dove straight into the theology. We've done a lot with it, but today we're going to focus on it all together as a wide community here. As we continue our Drawing the Lines series, all about creating healthy boundaries between us and others, I was led back to this story all about lament. Today we're expanding our boundary talk to talk about how we set boundaries between us and society or our culture or our communities that we're part of, our nation, even maybe our politics, etc. How do we stay true to ourselves in the midst of a community in a world that may want us to go against what we think and we believe? Another reason I turned back to Lamentations this week is because we are in a season of lament here at Journey. We have lost one of our own recently. We've had many people sick. This last week, many people were in the hospital. Many people are struggling with mental, physical health problems, some even both. And that's just to name a few of the things that are happening this week, right now, around us. It's heavy stuff. We as a community are in a season where we are being drawn to lament together. And we do this in a world that feels like it's becoming more and more divided, as the news seems to suggest. A world where we need some boundaries to care for ourselves, to get away from all of the noise around us, all the pain and suffering. The Book of Lamentations is a poetic masterpiece, in my opinion. And while it may be hard to read, I even felt like I was tearing up hearing the words this morning. This collection of poems gives voice to the need for grief, being honest with our feelings, being honest about all these difficult emotions that we tend to run away from. And Lamentations is structured in this really cool way. There are 5 poems, and 4 of them are done in acrostic pattern, meaning it's like an alphabetic form, where each verse of the poem begins with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So it would be like verse 1 starts with A, verse 2 starts with B, and it goes so on and so forth all the way through the Hebrew alphabet. It's as if these poets sat down and went back to the beginning, the basics, elementary stuff. But they also went back to the beginning of the fall of Jerusalem and wrote out in detail what they remembered and what had happened to them. And they worked their way through the grief one letter at a time, A to Z, or the Hebrew Aleph to Tav, 22 letters, one at a time. And what we learn in these collection of poems is that Jerusalem had broken their relationship with God. God had made Israel God's covenant people, meaning God signed into this contract of sorts where God agreed to support and care for the Israelite people. The rules were fairly simple, love God, follow God, and you're covered, right? But as we probably know, simple rules are not always easy to follow. And the Israelite people started turning from God, and they started placing their hope in these different political leaders and other nations, other gods. Those in power became corrupt, and even the religious authorities were killing people without due cause, as we learned later in the Book of Lamentations. So Lamentations paints this picture of a nation that had forgotten their God and was now experiencing the fallout of this broken relationship. Israel had forgotten who they were, what they believed, and who they served. A deep theology runs through this book that reveals that these poets who are writing here believed that God would punish those who disobeyed God. It's a theology that some Christians still hold to this day. If you follow God, God will reward you and things will be great. If you don't, God will punish you. It's a very punitive God who requires their way or no way. It's a God that sounds completely foreign to me. See, the problem with the Book of Lamentations is it's really hard to tell what all the acts in here, if it's God, or what are the acts of these colonizers and oppressors, these Babylonians that came through. Who is doing the acting here? Throughout these 5 poems, God is often conflated with the empire or the Babylonians. The Babylonians that destroyed Jerusalem were seen as a weapon of God, come to punish Jerusalem for their sins. And this strangely gave the Israelites some bit of comfort, which doesn't make sense. But the alternative look at this, and honestly probably the more difficult look, is that, if the Babylonians weren't a tool of God and Jerusalem was still destroyed, then where was God? Why was God absent? Why did God not protect the Israelites as promised? If God was using them, then they were safe. If God wasn't, they were alone. See, the first explanation where the Babylonians are working for God means that the Israelites are still in relationship with God. Even if it's not a great relationship, they're still in relationship. Whereas that second explanation suggests that God is absent and no longer in relationship with those who are suffering. And while Lamentations is hard to read because we hear so much about the horrors done to the Israelite people, there are these handful of moments when this radical hope springs forth out of the text. There are a couple of places where this punitive theology about God is stripped away and the poets reveal a different understanding of God. One of these moments, and arguably one of the most notable lines, often the most quoted lines for this entire book, comes from the third poem, towards the middle of the poem. So it's like right in the middle of this entire book. It's kind of the main thing here. So Lamentations 3:19 through 26 says this, "Remember my affliction and my wandering. It is bitterness. My soul remembered and remembers and sinks down within me. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have," get this, "I have hope. The steadfast love of God never ceases. God's mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. God is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in God." When you're reading through this book and you stumble across these words, they come as a bit of a shock, especially in context to the rest of what's going on in Lamentations. How can one have hope when all along they thought God was punishing them? How can these poets have hope when they have witnessed such horrific things? How can they have hope as they are still suffering in exile as they write? And how can we have hope in our great lament? The Book of Lamentations is a cautionary tale of what happens when we fail to create healthy boundaries with our society. The Israelites were naively following the orders of their leaders, religious and political alike. But these leaders were doing harmful things that the Israelites knew went against their religious practices and against their God. The rich were getting richer, the poor were poorer. Those suffering were cast aside as those in power were praised and dressed with fine clothes and fed fine foods. But when this other greater power, this empire, the Babylonians came through, everyone was wiped out. Man, woman, child, young, old, rich and poor alike were left with nothing. The places their hope had once lived in the empire of their own had completely crumbled. And now they were left with nothing. And they were left wondering where God was in all of the pain. One of my favorite themes in the Book of Lamentations is the idea of this God who sees us in our pain and affliction. This theology dates back to early stories in the Bible, all the way in Genesis. In fact, they come from the mouth of a woman given the name Hagar. You may be familiar with Hagar. Hagar was the midwife of Abraham and Sarah. She was a foreign woman who was enslaved and forced to conceive a child with Abraham. She was abused by Abraham and Sarah. And Hagar's name comes from Ha-ger, meaning the outsider, or the foreigner, or the alien. This is the title she's given. And at one point in Hagar's story, she is sent into the wilderness by Abraham and Sarah, the patriarch and matriarch of the Hebrew Bible. And she's sent out to the wilderness to die alone. She's cast out with very little resources, and she goes into the wilderness and she begins to weep. But God appears to Hagar in this wilderness space. In the midst of her great lament, God appears to her and lets Hagar know that she is not alone, that she is not invisible, and that her pain matters to God. And Hagar, this unnamed, enslaved foreign woman, is the first person, get this, she's the first person in the Hebrew Bible to give God a name. She names God first time. Go back through all the scriptures, she's the first one. Hagar says to God, "You are the God who sees." Meaning, you are the God who has seen me in all the crap that I've been through, and you will not leave me in this desert place alone. And this theology is taught throughout Scripture. It doesn't just end with Hagar. Hagar's theology becomes kind of the basis for which the Israelites know God, that God sees them in their pain. And in the Book of Lamentations, as these poets are wrestling with the pain and suffering of their own, they keep returning back to Mother Hagar, who reminded them that God does not cause affliction, but that God is with us and sees us in our suffering. As we face a world lamenting so much, even here in our community, experiencing so much suffering all around us, we may be tempted to turn to some dark places like they do in the Book of Lamentations. We may begin to wonder where God is in all of this. We may ask, why is God allowing these things to happen to our culture, our society, our nation, our humanity? We can grieve what we have lost and what has been taken from us. But God was never in the business of building empire.
Amen.
We're not meant to put our trust solely in our human hierarchies and social structures, our government, even our religious leaders, i.e. me. Because when we start building up these empires for ourselves, we start crushing people along the way. We lose track of God and we crave power instead. We even begin to think that whatever empire is the strongest must be of God. But Hagar's theology tells us differently, right? This radical hope that met Hagar in the wilderness, this radical hope that comes out of the words of exiled poets, this radical hope that finds us even here today. It reminds us that God sees us and we are not alone, especially in the most difficult moments of our lives. So we're called to trust in God, but not the empire. We're encouraged to set boundaries with our world and our nation, knowing that these are all human things that are imperfect, and they will never save us from the hard things in life. Life is really hard sometimes. We all can attest to that these days. But I'm telling you, God is here with us right now.
Yes.
And God sees us in our pain, and God laments with us. My prayer is this: knowing that you are the God who sees us in our affliction, have mercy on us. For we are tired and weary. Help us to place boundaries between us and the empire, and help us to love one another better. And God, grant us some radical hope that breaks through the lament, and give us peace. This is our prayer. Amen.
Amen. Boundaries. Sometimes we need them to help keep us contained, so we can gather our resources, so we can be available at a moment in time. Sometimes they keep out the bad. But one thing a boundary also does is bring us together, even though we call it a boundary. So think about what is the boundaries of your life each and every day, and how those boundaries can be used to help one another mend a relationship with someone else, with God, with those who are no longer here. Good peace.